Right, and soon we will get the computer and the screen synchronized, and let's see if that's worked. Yes, good. Right, so okay, and we actually have a kind of pointer. Right, so after this talk, you will know how to compare the differences between the ultrasound appearances of what's normal and the more common structural abnormalities. So the key questions, and again, apologies, I'm just out of sync a little bit, so I'll have a look at there, but which abnormalities can you exclude by looking at the head and looking at the stomach? Because if you do a biometry, that's what you'd be looking at. And then, importantly, how do you distinguish between the baby with and without the spina bifida? How do you exclude omphalocele and gastroschisis on the abdominal circumference? And then, last but not least, what are the features of lower urinary tract obstruction? Right, so you've heard what the head circumference measurement should look like. I think the only note, all this is all really true. Midline, cavum, septum pellucidum, and if you heard, it must be a completely black rectangle, nothing inside of it, otherwise you're not at a cavum. This... I'm a Bulls fan, so I can mention rugby again this morning after we managed to barely beat the Japanese again. And regular rugby ball-shaped skull, posterior horn less than 10 millimeters. They say the anterior horn slit-like, and that is true in the third trimester, but definitely not in the middle of the second trimester. But let's not worry too much about that. Abdominal circumference section, you've heard that. We don't need to go through that. That's also hopefully burnt in on your retinae. And now, some normal and abnormal appearances. Okay, so that's now just to get you sort of wondering what's happening. And we'll basically look at a couple of important planes, starting at the skull, brain, four-chamber view, abdominal circumference level, cord insertion, kidneys, amniotic fluid, and then size and relative size. Right. So again, firstly, and you've heard that before, is work out how the baby is lying. And have little Poppy next to you because she's going to teach you how to scan. And you've heard this morning, it says, hello baby, are you alive, where are you? And then figure out, how is this baby lying in the mom's tummy? Is she lying like this? Is she lying like this? Is she lying like that? And once you've worked out the relative position, then you know when you start scanning that you should actually work out the position of the baby in the mom's tummy, take away the probe, scratch your head, and then say, if I want to measure the femur, then I know I must go there. And, practice that for yourself to really work out how well you visualize the fetal position. So that's really, we're talking about abnormalities, and you can, much of what you see there doesn't really look nice, but we will go to the more specific abnormalities. But firstly, remember how the baby's lying, because in the end, much of the right or left things really depends on that. And now, of course, in the with the nice normal-looking head diameter here early on in gestation, and there you see the same head circumference later on in gestation. And why is this later in gestation? Why is that later than this? It's equal size, so it's we can't use size to guide us. Yes, so you can see there's the Sylvian fissure, and there you can see it's much more convoluted. The whole cortex is much more convoluted. You actually start struggling seeing the cavum, septum pellucidum, and the ventricle, which is basically the same absolute size, becomes relatively much smaller later on. Now, the things on this kind of view that we would look at in terms of the skull, what we talked about in the first trimester is anencephaly, where you just don't see the calvarium, you don't see the skull bones. Ventriculomegaly, where instead of that nice ventricle less than 10 millimeters, now it's only more than 10 millimeters. And now here you have ventriculomegaly, and if you try to kick this rugby ball, it's going to fly off in any direction, because it's not a nice, normally shaped rugby ball shape anymore, but looks as though it needs to be inflated a little bit, because it starts indenting here in front and looks more like a lemon. And what's the association with that? Slightly too much fluid in the ventricles, lemon-shaped skull. Right, it's a couple of things, not holoprosencephaly though, but keep that question parked somewhere at the distant corner of your mind. We'll come back to that. As we go down to the cerebellum, here we see there's a hemisphere, there's nothing in between, so maybe the vermis is absent. Maybe there's just something else that pushes the vermis out of the normal position where you would expect it. So either this is really, really bad news, or it's a completely normal baby, and it's, no one would expect that of someone that's starting to scan, that's sort of finding his or her way with biometry to figure that out. So that's a baby that needs to be sent off to someone that can figure it out. Going lower down in the neck, we see those pockets of fluid that we referred to in the first trimester as well, the cystic hygromas. Okay. Right. Now we get to spina bifida, because that is one of the specific points, and that's really, I know when I was an intern at working in general medicine, they said it's okay if a patient dies on your watch as long as she's received the first dose of anti-TB treatment. Now, I suppose, I don't know what nowadays, you probably need some antiretroviral treatment as well, but so I don't want to say it's okay if you miss something as long as you don't miss a spina bifida, but spina bifida is really common. It's often really, really, really bad news, and it's something that is amenable to ultrasound detection. I mean, even the relative junior at scanning should be able to pick up close to 90% of spina bifidas. And what do we see? There's a nice normal head, another nice normal head in cerebellum. Here we again see that head with a large ventricle, lemon-shaped. And what is this normal dumbbell shape of the cerebellum is now suddenly changed into a banana shape. And this kind of fruit salad is typically the cranial signs with which more than 80% of open spina bifidas are associated. So we've also been talking about how we should look at the spine, and but basically how the way to examine the spine is basically to look at these two levels. Look at the biparietal diameter level or head circumference diameter, look for ventriculomegaly, look at the cerebellum, and if those are normal, then there's not going to be a high lumbar or higher spina bifida. So if that's abnormal, then you know there is a spina bifida, you just need to go and find it. And here they show you the coronal views, which can be useful if you know there is a spina bifida to detect. But these are the sagittal views that are really the way that you should see. And this is really what the baby should lie like before you can send her out and say this baby's spine is normal. The spine anterior, you see it right down to the tip of the coccyx. What I'm missing on this slide, where are the ISWAC people, is actually showing the conus medullaris, where you see the bottom tip of the spinal cord. And again, that's not what you're going to see if you start scanning tomorrow, but in 2 weeks' time, 3 weeks' time, once you've done your 100 hours. How many hours in a week? No, 176. So how many hours do you need to sleep? I don't know. I found out I can sleep as little as 5 hours, and I function perfectly well. Just everybody around me gets extremely irritating. But say if you subtract 5 times 35, so you can put in 140 hours before this time next week, so you can get your 100 hours and be a good scanner in a week's time. Now, but joking aside, I mean, you need time for coffee and so on. So in 2.5 weeks' time, you should actually start seeing the conus medullaris, get that perfect sagittal view, and see the bottom tip of the spinal cord. And questions about the spine. As you see, there's no axial view here. So not to say the axial view doesn't have its place, but really, this is the view you want to make sure there's no spina bifida. Okay, ingrain that top one on your retina as well. Okay. Chest. Now, if you start scanning, you think of the heart, you just want to run away because it's just so complicated. But it's really, again, very simple. There's a heart. The heart fills. Sooner or later, I'll find my mouse. Someone moved my cheese and my mouse. There we go. So the heart is 1/3 of the chest. It points to the left. How do you know what's left? You ask Poppy, you know, Poppy, how are you lying? Which is your left hand? That's left, that's where the heart should be pointing. There's the left lung to the left of the heart, there's the right lung to the right of the heart, and they're all pretty much equal. So that's basically, I have to count to 3. Lung, lung, heart. And then inside the heart, you have to count to 4. You see, 1, 2, 3, 4 chambers with valves in between, and that's the heart, basically. Now, I mean, that, of course, oversimplifies it really, really. And, I mean, looking at the heart is a whole course on its own. But what is really just at the basic level of what you want to know is, are the lung fields okay? Because what don't we want to miss if we look at the chest, which is going to kill the baby in its first hour of life? Sorry? Hypoplastic left heart syndrome will... Sorry? Hypoplastic lungs. Okay, if there are no lungs, you're not going to breathe easily. So that's true. That's quite rare. What's much more common? Diaphragmatic hernia, and they always show you in the book those nice diaphragms, and those are completely useless at picking up diaphragmatic hernia. You want to look at the heart, and then suddenly you see there's a heart, but it's not. Yes, here we go. There's the heart, but it's not 1/3 of the chest size. It must be about 1/5 or something. There's a right lung, there's a left lung, and there's lots of other stuff in there. So either this is a diaphragmatic hernia, or it might be something like some kind of pulmonary lesion. And again, you don't need to worry about that. This is just someone to put on the next bus to Tygerberg or wherever you refer to sort this out. And again, I've told you, Poppy tells you, this is my left hand, so my heart's pointing to the left, the stomach is pointing to the left. And to my shame as well, not so long ago, me and the pediatric cardiologist, that's someone that we'd been following all along, that had some kind of really complex, congenitally corrected transposition of the heart. And we felt really chuffed that we picked it up until the baby was born, and we realized we both had on 3 separate occasions missed a complete situs inversus as well, which in the end didn't make, you know, anything in the prognosis, but, you know, you really feel extremely silly. And, you know, it might as well have been a clue to something much worse. Right, now we've scanned through the heart, now we get to the stomach. There's the stomach, and here you just have to count to 1. There's the stomach bubble. There's the stomach bubble, again, a slightly more advanced gestational age. Now, suddenly there are 2 bubbles. Okay, so what's wrong here? Double stomach syndrome. No, so what's happening here is that the first part of the duodenum is closed, so what you see there is the stomach, and then a dilated first part of the duodenum. And when would you first start seeing this? Do we see this in the first trimester? No. Do we see it at a 20-week scan? No, usually not. There's usually something 22, 24 weeks we start seeing this, when the small intestine should start working. And what is the most common single underlying cause of this? Down syndrome. So you see this, you start reaching for, not you, but the referring center starts reaching for the needles or amniocentesis when you see this. Okay, we try to count to 1, but we don't even get to 1 because there's no stomach bubble. So what's happening here? Okay, so either the baby's not swallowing, and it can be that it's not swallowing because whatever it swallows, it breathes out because there's a huge tracheoesophageal fistula. It can be that it's not swallowing because it can't swallow because its neuromuscular connections are shot, and then I would have expected lots more amniotic fluid around it. And the amniotic fluid actually looks pretty okay. And again, they talk about 4D scan, and what's the fourth dimension? Time. So you let time go by. You give her a cup of tea and, read the sari and catch up on the news in the huisgenoot. And I see you back in an hour. And maybe the stomach is filled up again. And if it hasn't, then she can take her sari and her huisgenoot and get onto the bus to sort out what's happening. Right, and here we see stomach, lots of other stuff. So what's happening here? So lots of fluid, so ascitic fluid, and this, which of these babies must be, okay, let's go to the last one. And this, lots of fluid, lots of fluid, lots of fluid, pockets, pockets, pockets. So you can't really say for sure. It might be a lower intestinal obstruction, but where that's sitting, that looks pretty much like kidney to me. And so maybe that's a nasty kidney obstruction. So which of these babies? Now all four of them are standing in front of the bus, and the bus driver says, I've got space for one. And they're actually checking today, so I can't just load up more people. So I can't, as usually, put 20 people in my 12-seater. So one of you can go. So which of those get onto the bus? The ascites, why? So that's potentially treatable. That might be a baby that's anemic from parvovirus, or maybe we don't see what's happening and the heart goes like this. It's got a supraventricular tachycardia that you've forgot to look because you didn't take your nice systematic approach. You just put on the scan and you saw this. And this baby has a potential treatable condition. Where the others, whether they go next week or 2 weeks later, except maybe for this one, if she gets close to 24 weeks, is not that important. Okay, umbilical cord. Right, so we're still scanning nice and, where's my scanner? Nice and cross-section through Poppy, and of course Poppy isn't lying straight, so if you go transversely, if you just do this, you start off coronally, go axially and end up coronally again. So actually I have to follow little Poppy's outlines. But anyway, here we've reached the umbilical cord. And now usually they say the umbilical cord is above the bladder, and that should be the case. If it's not, then there's something funny happening. And again, what we saw in the first trimester views, a little bit of hyperechogenic material into the umbilical cord. Is that a cord hematoma, or what is that? Well, it is there, right? It stands there, omphalocele. So now the babies don't come tagged with that, but it can be really subtle, it can be huge, or it can be really subtle. The really subtle ones are the ones that to watch out for, because it's huge. I mean, the dad's going to stand at the door and say, what's that big thing next to the stomach? But if it's just this tiny little knuckle of bell into the umbilical cord, those you must be worried about. Gastroschisis, we saw that looked like cauliflower earlier on. Now that bowel is starting to dilate, so you just see all those loops of dilated bowel floating around. And maybe just one thing, what would be the main, if your baby has one of these, which should it have? gastroschisis. It's still not a nice diagnosis to have. You know, we've always been told, oh no, don't worry, not that much in associated anomalies, but still it's not, there still is mortality prenatally and postnatally linked to it. There are still babies that sacrifice a huge amount of bowel. It can still be linked to other, especially things like intestinal atresia. So it's not still not a nice diagnosis, but it is the better of the two. And omphalocele, not so nice because of the huge risk of underlying chromosomal abnormalities especially. Right, now the kidneys. Hands up, who can see the kidneys? Right, okay, so you can't really see the kidneys. So normal kidneys you can't really see. So at 12 weeks, if you don't see the kidneys, you don't know if they're there unless you see a bladder, because at 12 weeks the amniotic fluid just leaks across the membranes. At 20 weeks, almost all the amniotic fluid is produced by the kidney. So if there's normal amniotic fluid, there has to be at least one functioning kidney. So if you don't really see kidneys, then you really go looking, and you can see them on the axial view, and you go looking for them on the coronal view. And often the coronal view, now looking at little poppy like this, the coronal view is much better because you can see both, you can compare them side by side. There's, as any laterality, always a little bit of difference, but not a huge difference. And depending on your machine, the one will be slightly more and the other slightly less echogenic, so don't worry about that. Get little poppy to turn around and watch from the other side now and see it's the other way around. But if there's a big difference in amount of fluid or echogenicity, then you know there is a problem. The renal pelvis sits in the middle, and throughout pregnancy it should be less than 7 millimeters. We've always been taught 20 weeks less than 5, 30 weeks less than 10. And now it seems they want to make things as simple as the brain, where everything's less than 10, so this less than 7. But anyway, if it's too big, you'll really start noticing it. Bladder, below the umbilical cord, you can put on color and see the arteries running to the umbilical cord. Here. And there's nothing inside. And again, the bladder can be empty or relatively empty. And the bladder cycle is much quicker than the stomach cycle. So usually if you see an empty bladder at the start of the scan, by the end of the scan, unless you're really quick, it should be filled up. And again, if it remains empty, the kidneys look fine, but the bladder remains empty, there can still be, if you really don't see the bladder, then there can still be other problems like extra fee or whatever. So you still give the mom a cup of tea, and the maybe she's into the rooibos and she can wait and come back later. And let's just go on. So now, the other thing that is really good to know about is urinary tract obstruction. And why is that? Why do we bother about that? Two things. The one, you talked about pulmonary hyperplasia. If it's bad enough, there's no amniotic fluid. If there's no amniotic fluid, the baby can't breathe in amniotic fluid. Its lungs don't develop, and it cruises on during pregnancy, but it dies soon after birth. And the other issue is, there is urinary tract obstruction, but the baby manages to bypass it and gets enough amniotic fluid, is going to be okay, but it's a sitting duck for ascending infections. And these are babies that arrive in the emergency room really, really, really septicemic, because each time it gets a bit grumpy and it gets a bit niggly and a bit clingy, and they say, oh, he's teething or this or that, and meanwhile he's building up one heck of a pyelonephritis. So if you know about that beforehand, then those are kids that are followed up, and you can actually prevent lots of morbidity from that. So basically, The appearance of urinary tract obstruction, if it's total outlet obstruction, there's no amniotic fluid, and you're going to pick it up in the amniotic fluid. And otherwise, depending on where it is, you'll see huge bladder. Here we have a baby with a huge bladder, left ureter, and the right side looks pretty normal. And others can have a huge bladder, both kidneys are blown up, or any combination of those. But basically, you'll just see there's a counting one stomach, one bladder, and lots of other pockets of fluid in between. That's someone to refer to get sorted out. About amniotic fluid volume, I don't really need to talk about, except that if the kidneys can't drain, then amniotic fluid's going to dry up. And these are all couple of pretty horrific pictures of urinary tract obstruction from really early on, where we see that megacystis, which we ran into earlier, here a bit later on in pregnancy, where again you see a dilated bladder, dilated ureters. But still fair amount of amniotic fluid, so this is a baby that should be okay eventually. All right. So, after this whirlwind tour through all the abnormalities that people write handbooks about, and again go and make that. How many downloads was there of Abuamat's book, did Katja say? 50. How many downloads was there of Abuamat's book? 50,000. 25,000. Now there are how many? Well, let's say all told 700 listening today, so let's make that 25,700 by midnight tonight. So you go to ISWAC's website, and it is under, I think it's under education or outreach or something like that, but if you get lost, it's a good website to get lost in. You won't see anything your wife can't look over your shoulder and see. But under education, you'll see there is something that says downloadable book, and you just click it and download it and go through that. And actually, much of what we covered today is in there, and it's a really, really good book just to know in and out before you start practicing what we've been preaching at you today. Right, so your first key point, you have to know what you're looking at. Second key point, you have a consistent approach to the scan. In other words, head, neck, heart, lungs, etc., etc. So that if you're halfway through and you have to go and quickly do a delivery, and you come back and you look at the last picture on the screen, and you can see, okay, there's the stomach bubble, the abdominal circumference. Okay, now I need to go down to the kidneys. That you don't need to worry about and think, what have I done, what haven't I done? That you really have a very set pattern, that you make sure that you don't skip something, that you forget to look at whether this baby has a head. And then find the long axis of the fetus and assess the appearances. In other words, you figure out how this baby is lying and then work through it systematically. And once you've found the longitudinal axis of the baby, then most of what we've been teaching you is actually going through the fetus on axial view, head, neck, heart, stomach, kidneys, umbilical insertion, bladder. And then, of course, the limbs, but that is a different topic. And, oh yes, there is the limbs as well. Then, of course, you get to the femur and what did we say, at 12 weeks you want to know 4 limbs, each with 3 elements, 3 long bones, and then bits and pieces added onto the end of it. All right. And again, just the same story again. I have a consistent scanning technique. Don't go jumping, say, oh, here's a hand, let me look at the hand. Oh, now the baby's thin, now I can see the heart nice, and now I look at the heart. So really be rigorous with yourself, that you go for something, find it, and then move on. And it's going to take long, but it gets quicker and quicker. And each section, make sure you've got the right quality of section. That it's a picture that you can send to someone and say, I've seen this abdominal scan, and they can say, oh, great, it's been magnified to full the screen. The focus is right, the settings are right. And not that you send it to someone, you get an email back to see, you know, next time send me a picture, don't send me a postage stamp of a picture, you know, and really figure out again on the probe what's right, what's left, what's up and down. Do you go this and this? Do you this and this? How do you get to that ideal section? And don't give the mom a Coke and a bar one beforehand that the baby swims around and you just sit there and hope and pray that sooner or later all the planes will pass by you. And last one, and that's probably the most difficult one because we tend to scan in bursts, lots of scanning around the 12 weeks, lots around the 20 weeks, and then little bits and pieces later on. But I always also teach the fellows and registrars to have the gestational age on the screen, that you immediately know I'm looking at the 26 weeks fetus, and it's like that story of learning to distinguish between real and fake jade. If you just handle it, your subconscious starts picking up. If you each time have the gestational age and you know that this is a 26 weeks baby, this is a 32-week baby, and then suddenly you see a 32-week baby looking like a 26-week baby, and then your little alarm bell starts ringing and says something's not quite right. And that's it. Questions?